Professor Terry Dooley, who's going to talk to us about Carton House, a brief history from 1730 to the present. Terry is the head of the Department of History and Professor of History and Director of the Centre for the Study of Historic Irish Houses and Estates. He's the author of many books, including The Decline and Fall of the Dukes of Leinster, 1872 to 1948, Love, War, Death and Madness, and Burning the Big House, the story of the Irish country house in a time of war and revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, Terry Dooley.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and again, you're all very welcome. I'm not going to keep you very long, right? So this is about the height of it. When Elaine and I first sat down about last May or so to begin to plan this lecture series, I mean, our biggest challenge was to see, who we would get to speak or what topics we would cover. I'm glad to see that obviously what we have chosen has made a difference, and that you've come in such fantastic numbers every night out to the series itself, and again, thank you very much for that. But I think I said on the first night as well that Maynooth has a very strong case to make for being one of Ireland's most historic towns, tracing its origins back to at least the 12th century, if not before, and you will have heard much about that from Arnold Horner last week. But at one end of the town, you will have Ireland's only ducal residence, that belonging to the Duke of Leinster, the Fitzgerald family dukes from 1766 onwards. And of course, at the other end of the town, you have another big house, the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland. Until fairly recent times, the most important institution working out of the country, if you like. And of course, it's with Carton that this evening's talk is concerned. And you will have got some, I suppose, semblance of its importance from Arnold's talk last week. Suffice to say, I mean, we could give dozens of lectures, I would think, on Carton. And somebody of my experience should have better sense than to call one of them a brief history from 1730 to the present day. So all I can hope to do is to give you a flavour. And what I am going to do is tell you a story, because I think that storytelling as part of history is very important as well. And I'm going to tell you the story of Carton through the prism of the first 7 Dukes of Leinster. And the 18th century isn't my strong point, so you'll excuse me if I skirt across that fairly quickly until we get to the actual post-famine period itself, when we begin to look at it through the theme more of decline. We'll spend longer on decline, actually, than we'll spend on rise. But suffice to say that the beginnings of Carton, early 18th century, and it coincides with the emergence of the family once again to social and political prominence after something of, a spell, I won't say in the wilderness, but a time when they were trying to, consolidate or reconsolidate their position in Irish society following the calamitous effect or impact of the Silk and Thomas Rebellion of the 1530s. And they re-emerge under Robert Fitzgerald, who you see here, along with his wife Mary O'Brien, who was a daughter of the 3rd Earl of Inchiquin. And it is them who begin to consider or contemplate the building of a new house in order to reflect their re-emergence into Irish society. Now, by the way, and this is important as we're going forward, they have 18 children, 14 of whom live to adulthood. And, the importance of that I'll come back to in a little while. So the first thing that Robert seemingly contemplated was rebuilding the castle itself. Robert Boyle, the wealthiest man in Ireland, the first Earl of Cork, had done quite a lot of work on it in the 17th century, but again, by the 1730s, it had gone beyond the state of, reconstruction, for the want of a better term. So they give up on that idea, and instead they focused on a house that was in existence in Carton, or Old Carton at the time. You get a sense of its architectural design, the landscape around her, and so on, from the image that you see in the middle here. Robert thought that house itself was too small and the domain too out of date for a great nobleman, and therefore begins to plan for the construction of the great Palladian mansion to the design of Richard Castle, that you know it as today. He succeeded in 1744 by his son James Fitzgerald, 20th Earl of Kildare, elevated to the Marquess of Kildare and then 1st Duke of Leinster in 1766. And James, of course, was married to Emily Lennox, daughter of the 2nd Duke of Richmond. They get married in 1747, and this consolidates his social status, political connections through his wife's line and so on. And her sister, of course, Louisa, was married to Thomas Connolly at Castletown, thereby uniting the two great houses in this particular area. And they begin or continue the embellishment of the house, the interior of the house, and then the development of the landscape or the parkland. So the grandeur of Carton reflects very much James's elevation to the dukedom and indeed the extravagant tastes of his wife, the Chatelaine Emily. You can see evidence of this to this day in the Gold Salon, of course, one of the most important existing extant 18th century rooms in Ireland, the great stucco work by the Lafranchinis, the Chinese bedroom, and as a result of all this extravagance, James at times had to scold his wife for her overspending. For example, a folly, he told her, spending so much considering the number of children we have. And that was 19 children, right? So in 2 generations, 1914, that's 33 children. And again, that's important because the estate effectively begins to operate as, it's like a social welfare system, right? And the family, the heir to the estate, becomes responsible in very many respects for maintaining the social status of his siblings. And that's why I refer to here ubiquitous family charges. And these family charges are handed down generation after generation, and then cumulatively by the 19th century, as we see, they will have disastrous impact. Again, another example of the wonderful grandeur of the interior of the house is reflected in the collections. What you're looking at here is the famous Carton silver service, an astonishing dinner service with the mark of the London Royal Goldsmith George Wicks, made in 1745 to 46, the year before James marries Emily. And it contained 5,295 ounces of silver, cost about £4,000 at the time, and the last time it was sold, not that terribly long ago, it made 2 million. Each individual piece was embossed with the arms of the Fitzgeralds. Now, the only reason I'm showing you these is just to give you some sense of the grandeur inside the house itself. Next project that they undertake is the design or the redesign of the landscape, in keeping with changing trends and changing fashions. Now, it is said that Emily wanted Lancelot Capability Brown to come to Carton to design the landscape for her, and allegedly Capability Brown says, I can only come to Ireland when I'm finished with England. And it never happens. But you can see from the painting here by Devis that they themselves were the architects of their own landscape, or at least that is the image that they wanted to project. It's all part of creating this visual legacy that they leave behind them, whether in paintings such as this, landscape paintings such as this, or portraits. But as Fionnuala O'Kane points out about the development of the parkland, as they gained, that means Emily and James, as they gained in confidence and experience, their landscape became a setting for their private interests, a learning environment for their children, and a stage for their plays, balls, and masks. Again, just to give you a sense of the fact that I think from the minute these houses are built and invested in, then from that point on, they're actually in the process of decline. Sustainability becomes a key issue. And at all times you'll find, because of the economic ups and downs and so on, that they run into financial difficulties from one generation to the next. James writing to Emily, for example, in 1759, I have performed all the commissions that belong to you. As to pictures, tables, brooches, they have not been inquired after yet, and I'm afraid to look for them. They will cost so much, and this year, I fear, will be my ruin. Carton will cost so much and no money coming in. There never was anything like the want of money here, and in Dublin, I hear, it is as bad. But it didn't stop them from continuing to spend lavishly. Here you have William, their son, who becomes the second Duke of Leinster, and you also see their townhouse, which is Leinster House in Dublin, originally Kildare House, because it was built during his marquisate, but changed to Leinster House when he's elevated to the dukedom. And the house itself had a great gallery designed to house the painting collection that was inherited by the family through William's marriage to Amelia St. George. This is the powerhouse, the townhouse, the powerhouse, from which really where really the political connections and so on are made. In 1795, when Thomas Malton visited the gallery, he reported on the most important works he saw there, which he said included paintings attributed by him to Rembrandt, Claude Lorraine, Van Dyck, and many others. Of course, as my good colleague in the history department, Alison Fitzgerald, points out, we have to be very careful about whether or not these attributions are authentic. And she has shown, that we need to question very many of them. William also added to the design of the landscape, and he memorialised his efforts by commissioning 6 views of Carton Domain. And here you see 3 of them. He commissioned them from Thomas Roberts, 2 of which were executed by William Ashford after Roberts' premature death in 1777. And again, the noted historians Laffin and Rooney point out that the 6 images formed an unashamed celebration of life behind the walls of an enclosed domain and represent the apex of the subject's portrayal in Irish art. But from them, you get a very good sense of how wonderful, magnificent the landscape was by the middle of the 18th century. Now, you're looking again at William, you're looking at his wife here, Amelia St. George, and you're looking at William's younger brother, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, United Irish leader, who of course dies from his wounds following his capture in 1798. Not going to touch on him at all, because this is the subject of Liam Chambers' talk next week. But suffice to say, as a result of the 1798 rebellion, and indeed the rebellion that followed a few years later, the Robert Emmet rebellion, the suppression of the rebellion in Kildare left William's lands, we are told, almost desolate, and his tenants in no position to pay their rents. Lady Sarah Napier wrote, "The poor Duke of Leinster, how my heart bleeds for him. His lost brother Edward and the entire ruin of his fortune, perhaps forever, are the preliminaries to his sorrows." Now, the preliminaries to his sorrows, his wife died the following year in 1799. But again, the point has been made that there are times when the family are going through fairly rough financial difficulties. Again, 9 children left by this generation, adding to the already huge debt burden that had been gathered from families before. So, now we move to the 3rd Duke of Leinster, Augustus Frederick Fitzgerald. He inherits the estate at the age of 13 in 1804. And really, he strides like something of a colossus through 19th century Irish history. And yet, you'll be hard pressed to find any reference to him in any of the survey history books and so on of the century itself. Now, first of all, of course, he is a prominent political player. He also has this very mixed relationship with the other great player of the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, Daniel O'Connell. At one stage, they're close allies because, of course, Fitzgerald or Leinster is a liberal Whig. Therefore, he's in favour of the granting of civil and religious liberties to Catholics. So he's a sort of a tepid supporter of Catholic emancipation. And the fact that he is not more open about it leads O'Connell at one stage to say about him, that most miserable of miserable dukes. And before that, he had been much more flattering towards him and called him the Great Duke or the Grand Duke, right? But of course, if he supports Catholic emancipation, he is not going to support reform of the Act of Union, right? Which was O'Connell's next major project after emancipation. And now O'Connell writes about him, the Duke of Leinster, his name operates like vomit in my mouth. But it's this relationship, I think, that probably is instrumental in our lack of understanding or lack of knowledge maybe about Augustus. So anybody out there who's looking for a very good biography to write, undoubtedly this is one person that deserves it. So during the famine, now we've heard bits and pieces about the famine already, right? And I think Arnold made the point last week, Maynooth must have been a fascinating place during the course of the famine itself, right? Because of course you have the great square being built over here, across the road here. But you also have the Duke of Leinster involved in various charitable movements or organisations, such as the Mansion House Committee that inquired into the causes of the famine. He is said to have supported the enforced payment of rates, and that was for the upkeep of the workhouses and the poor, or the relief of the poor. And critics would say, well, it was easy for him to do so because his estate was populated by strong farmers and he wasn't responsible for paying their rates in the first place, right? So I just think that Maynooth during the famine, the role of Augustus Frederick Fitzgerald again requires much deeper analysis and research. But Thomas Babington Macaulay, British politician and historian, described him as the good old Duke of Leinster, the most liberal and generous of landlords. And he's one of the few landlords that Cecil Woodham Smith picks out in her work on the Great Hunger and describes him in the same way. But there are questions about it, and those questions will have to be answered. Now, a bit like his predecessors, his father and his grandfather before him, he gave his attention to improving his house and the domain at Carton. And that's partly facilitated, of course, by the sale of the townhouse in 1814 when he sold it to the Dublin Society. And by 1817, he is embarked on the remodelling of Carton under Richard Morrison, again, the preeminent architect of his time. And again, you can see here an example of Morrison's dining room and the sort of changes that he brings into the house. Lord Dunopmore, when he visits in 1822, he talks about everything going on in the most magnificent style in Carton. Again, Arnold last week just touching on it for those of you who may not have been there, but between the 1820s and the 1840s, you have a lot of development going on in the town itself. You have the refurbishment of town buildings, you have the extension of the college, which Susan alluded to, you have the arrival of the railway, you have labourers' cottages in the town being greatly improved, and in the later part of the 1840s, you have the clearing of the castle area. It had been cleared of the houses and cabins that were located, if you like, within the ruins. And this, of course, is in anticipation of the royal visit of Queen Victoria to Carton and Maynooth in 1849. And the image that you see to the bottom right is the peasants dancing on the lawn of Carton to entertain Queen Victoria when she visited. But first of all, the economy, of course, recovers remarkably quickly from the calamitous effects of the famine. And from about 1851 on, we have, this growth or sustained growth in economic prosperity. And with except for a temporary hiccup in the 1860s, this will last until the beginning of agricultural depression, which gives rise to the land war from 1877 onwards. And during that time, the landscape will have changed greatly. Now, there is no doubt, and we know for a fact, that Leinster did evict tenants from the estate, right? And he did provide emigration, voluntary emigration, for some of them by putting them on ships, basically, and sending them off to America. But the landscape will have changed in the sense that farms will have got bigger. And over time, you'll see the growth of these extensive or strong farms that effectively ring Carton. And they're acting almost like a buffer zone between the Duke and the rest of the community. And in 1872, there comes a very important point in the family history, and that is the coming of age of the Earl of Offaly, who is the third Duke's grandson. So at the same time, as you'll see from the images here, you'll have the third Duke of Leinster, his son Charles, who is the Marquis of Kildare, and now Gerald, the Earl of Offaly, all alive at the same time. But the coming of age is an important ritual in the life of an aristocratic estate. And what happens in this case is a committee is put together, typically committee put together, and they will commission the design of an address, which you see here, unfortunately, a very blurred version of it. But you'll get a sense of what it's about. Coat of arms of the family, then the address to the Earl of Offaly himself. And in the course of the address that is drawn up by the strong farmers of the local community, about 200 of whom will sign a petition that will go along with this address to be presented to him. They say that we pray that the good and prudent guides of your youth may long be spared to you. We are proud of your name. We feel that the history of your family guarantees a continuance of its well-known kindness, and we think we rightly interpret your lordship's feelings when we say that we are sure you will regard that history as the brightest and noblest guiding star of your own career. And the address will refer to the fact that Fitzgerald's before him had risen out in rebellion. They had stood against the crown when it was necessary for them to do so, and so on. And the idea here is that in the presentation of the gift, that the praise will be reciprocated with the maintenance of the status quo. And in estate towns and villages, the newspapers describe all of these great rejoicings that goes on. In the pretty little village of Maynooth, for example, we're told that there was an impressive fireworks display that lit up the night sky, while the local band recently supplied with instruments by the Duke marched up and down Leinster Street, right? So it's all part of the ritual, all part of the celebrations. And by accepting the gift itself, then the Duke is entering into this, if you like, social contract that things will continue as they have been in the past. But this is 1872, right? And the Duke has deliberately waited to get this, if you like, celebration out of the way before he tackles a very important issue that has developed around the passing of Gladstone's Land Act 2 years earlier in 1870. And to simplify this, Gladstone's Land Act gave tenants the right to compensation for improvements done to their farms or holdings in the event of them being evicted. And this, according to Leinster and indeed many of his peers, was an infringement on their rights as landlords, and he objected strenuously to it. And in 1872, after the coming of age was got out of the way, he introduced what becomes the infamous Leinster lease, whereby he attempts to get his tenants to sign away their right to compensation. And this in turn leads to the growth of what becomes the Kildare Tenants Defence Association. Now you get these defence associations springing up in different parts of the country at this time for the same reasons. And they're like the forerunners to the Land League less than 10 years later, from 1879 or so. And the image that you're looking at is an iconic image of the Land War era. It is taken from the Illustrated London News. It shows Michael Byton, who is a peripatetic Land League organiser, in the main the square in Athy, burning the Leinster lease. So a symbolic sign of defiance. But the lease is tied on to a 1798 pike. And the significance of that, of course, goes back to Lord Edward Fitzgerald, right? So history, they use it, or it's used against them, which is very often the case. But one thing is for sure, that after 1872, there is a definite change in the relationship between the Duke and, if you like, the wider community. It represents the twilight of paternalism and deference on the Leinster estate. And it also coincides with the introduction of the Secret Ballot Act in 1872, which begins to dilute landlord power at election time. The point I also made, that the emergence after the famine of this strong Catholic middle class, and now they're clamouring for a commensurate share in the governance or the running of their own country. And you have the emergence of Irish nationalism. So if you like, a perfect storm is beginning to gather at this time. And the Duke dies in 1874. And one of the things that he orders or instructs is essentially his funeral be closed off to the public. Whereas in the past, this again would have been, a massive ceremonial success, if you like, where thousands of people would have gathered at it. So there is a strained relationship on the estate for a time, which, for example, results in the Duke evicting one of his most prominent tenants from a farm, and that is St. Patrick's College in Maynooth, right? From a farm at Lara Bryan, but they will come back. I mean, the whole thing will be, it'll be sorted, for the want of a better term, when it suits both parties, right? But it is perhaps the beginning of the end. In 1877, you have a global economic depression. And that, of course, impacts on Ireland the same way as it impacts elsewhere. Without going into the actual cause of it, suffice to say, this economic depression gives rise to the formation of the Irish National Land League, which is the first mass movement that is organised against the system, if you like, of landlordism. And the land war, the first phase of the land war that lasts from 1879 to 81, is significant because it results in the passing of the 1881 Land Act. Now, the Land Act, right, probably, well, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most important outcomes of the Act is that it gives rise to the establishment of the Irish Land Commission, a body that will dominate rural Ireland for nearly a century or so afterwards. But part of the job of the Land Commission is to set up fair rent fixing courts that will adjudicate fair rents between landlords and tenants. Now, because of the political turmoil, if you like, of the time, then fair rents invariably come to mean lower rents. You don't have to go to the land court if the landlord decides that he will enter into negotiations himself with his tenants. And they can do it, therefore, through the aegis, if you like, of the land agency, which is what the Duke of Leinster decides to do. This is the fourth Duke now, Charles Fitzgerald, and he didn't favour his tenants going into court. So from the spring of 1882, he and his agents begin to negotiate under this legitimate alternative that exists. And by the end of May, nearly all of the Leinster tenants have signed agreements giving them rental reductions of 20 to 25%. Again, the significance of this is that he has inherited massive debts from the previous generations. Now his rents are being diminished by up to a quarter. And while the agent says on 31st of May 1882 There is the best feeling here, and I do believe that the rents will be paid punctually and pleasantly in future. Continued economic depression begins to squeeze landlords like the Duke of Leinster. And as a body, then they begin to go to they effectively lobby the government for something to get them over this, what they thought at the time was probably a temporary hiccup. And in 1882, the government introduced what is known as the Settled Land Act Ireland, right? So it's for Ireland only. And under the terms of this act, the law of settlement that in the past prevented heirs to an estate selling off heirlooms and land and so on is relaxed. And it's crucial in understanding the beginning and the breakup of country house collections. From that point onwards, what you will find is that landlords begin to sell off their most important collections. Works of art, curios, silver, furniture, and so on. More likely to be sold now than it is to be collected, as it would have been over the past, or in the past. And of course, there's a vibrant market for all of this now, because you have the rise of the great American plutocratic families, and they're scouring Britain and Europe and so on for the very things that Irish landlords and their British counterparts are trying to get rid of. At the turn of the century, 140 paintings are sold from Carton, including works attributed again to Bruegel and Gainsborough, for example, right? So from this point onwards, this is what you'll find, the dispersal of country house contents to the four winds. Fifth Duke of Leinster, Gerald. When Gerald inherits, we're back to the same point of inheriting this great debt. But as a result of land legislation, we are moving from the point of where the land legislation is dealing just with the fixing of fair rents to now beginning to focus on the transfer of land ownership from landlords to tenants. The problem is that they haven't yet come up with the mechanisms that provide the incentives for landlords to sell and tenants to buy. One thinks the price is too high, the other thinks the price is too low. But under the 1885 Land Act, some do begin to sell significant tracts of land, including the Dukes of Leinster. They don't sell any land up this part because this is where the core estate is. What they do is they sell land in the south of the county. And they sell, by the end of March 1890, 337 farms on 19,200 acres, which is about a third of the whole of the estate, for £246,400. And virtually all of that money is used to pay off the debts that Gerald has inherited. And you now can begin to see the beginnings of retrenchment. And to give you just a couple of examples, for December 1887, we have a servants' wage accounts that lists only 19 employees as opposed to 44 3 years previously, right? So what are gone now are the, excuse the expression, the piss pot boy and the clock winder, right? These symbols of our aristocracy are gone. So when he dies, Gerald's obituary in the Freeman's Journal will rightly point out that the Duke's income was not as large as one might be inclined to think from the extent of his estates and the great position he held. Family charges and the lessened value of land as letting farms cut off much of the ducal resources, right? Now, we must move in another direction, right, just for a little while, because an individual case study such as this is an excellent way of examining the interplay between various factors. Like we've touched on political, we've touched on economic and social, but what about personal? What about, implosion from inside, if you like, as well as all the factors that are coming to play from nationally and indeed for that matter, internationally. So in 1884, Gerald married the very beautiful Hermione Duncombe, daughter of the first Earl of Faversham. And I mean, all the contemporary descriptions of Hermione, describe her presence, her beauty, her personality, and so on. Clara Grant Duff, for example, writes, "I have seen men in top hats running like hares down Rotten Row to see the Duchess ride past on her big black horse." She is a very talented young woman, artist, sculptress, and so on. She's vivacious, lots of personality, complete opposite, in fact, to the way Gerald has been presented. A very serious dour man who had expectations of his young bride and how she should behave as the chatelaine of Carton. And what you're looking at here is Hermione with two of her sons, Maurice, born in 1887, and Desmond, born in 1888. So the first few years of their marriage seems to have been relatively happy. She gets on with doing what new ladies of the house did in the past, and developing it to her own taste to some extent as well. But there is an extraordinary series of letters which have survived between Hermione and her best friend, Lady Evelyn de Vesey, who lived in Abbeyleix House in County Laois. And I mean, they're very personal, they're very revealing, they're not at all like the type of letters one would expect to read from Victorian correspondence. And it's clear from them that she suffers from postpartum depression after the birth and death of her firstborn child, which was a daughter. One of the letters she says, "After my first little baby was born, the one that died, I don't know if I fancied it or if it is true, but a great large fly kept on flying around the ceiling, and all that night its wings kept on beating, the baby won't live, the baby won't live, and now it is the legions of black dogs keep on saying it's all of no use, and perhaps it isn't." Now, the black dogs, of course, is an expression that Churchill, for example, uses to describe his Great Depression. And then you begin to see that the marriage is beginning to actually break down and fail, and again, it's very well or graphically described by her in her letters. Again, just to choose one. What I resent is that Kay is Kildare, right? She always called him Kildare. Has no more wish than I have that we should live marital man. He still insists on sleeping in my room for fear of what the servants may think, even though he knows what a bad sleeper I am, and that except alone I cannot sleep, and that the servants have only to listen at the door to be aware that recrimination continues late into the night and begins early in the morning. So at this stage, it all becomes fairly poignant, right? And it's a difficult one to I suppose describe. But in 1889, she meets her best friend's brother, Hugo Charteris, then styled Lord Elcho. You could describe him as one of the great cads of late 19th century Britain. A character, for example, who continuously calls in the House of Lords the House of Commons for Parliament to be suspended so they can all go to the Epsom Derby. So she has an affair, a long-standing affair with Hugo, and she becomes pregnant, and she gives birth to a son, Edward, right? And at that stage, herself and the Duke have become estranged, and she moves out of Carton for a while, and rears Edward for a short time before her sister convinces the Duke that the best thing to do is, of course, bring them back into the family fold. And in 1893, Edward is still an infant, they return to Carton. And they return to Carton just in time, if you like, for Edward to actually become a recognised part of the Fitzgerald family, right? At least, we'll come back to this in a little while. Shortly after that, the Duke contacts Typhus, probably on a visit to Dublin, and nothing can be done for him, and he dies in Carton. And shortly after that, Hermione contacts or develops tuberculosis or consumption, right? And on the 20th of March 1895, having spent months going across or going through Europe, trying to find a cure, including even visiting Lourdes, she dies at Menton in the south of France. So now there are 3 young sons who have been left behind, and the estate passes into the trusteeship, led by the chief trustee, Lord Frederick Fitzgerald, who was the Duke's brother. And this is an enigmatic sort of a character, right? He doesn't seem to have left anything behind him that will tell us, a great deal about him, right? And he was probably cute in that respect. The eldest son, Morris, is not due to come of age until 1908. So the trustees have the power to act on his behalf. Of course, in the meantime, those mechanisms that I talked about that tenants and landlords wanted to put in place for the sale and transfer of land ownership are put in place by George Wyndham, the Chief Secretary, following a report drawn up by representatives of landlords and tenants in a conference or a convention of 1902-03, right? Now, under the terms, and what the image you're looking at here is, a map of Carton and its surrounding lands. Under the terms of the Wyndham Land Act of 1903, landlords are going to be paid very generously for the sale of their estates. But as well as that, as an extra incentive, they will be given a 12% cash bonus if they decide to sell them. So if you're going to sell your estate for £100,000, you'll get a £12,000 cash bonus on top of that. The cash bonus, the benefit of it is, no matter how much you owe, the cash bonus can go into your back pocket and you will be left with something to invest. As a result, you have this flooding of the markets, if you like, or coming onto the markets of landlords who want to sell because of the encumbered or indebted nature of the vast majority of them. Everything is intended to give them more confidence that when they get money and they invest it, then they will be as well off as they were before they sold their estates, and so on. And of course, those who devised the terms of the Act felt and were confident that landlords might stay in Ireland or would stay in Ireland and invest their money in Ireland. But it was never written into the Act, right? With the result that they didn't. And therefore, in large part, the money leaves the country. But another point I think is worth making on this, you're looking at an image which is called the wire pullers, right? And these are the very type of strong farmers who dictate the terms for everybody on the estate itself when a price has been agreed between landlord and farmers. They agree to pay 25 years the annual rental of the estate. That's the price that's demanded, and they agreed to give. So if you're a tenant and you're paying £100 rent per year, you multiply that by 25, you'll pay $2,500 for your farm, and you'll pay for it over a period of 60 plus years, right? I can't remember the actual interest rate, 4.5, 4.6% or whatever. But this quotation from Matthew Minch, Brewer and Miller and so on, but also he had been MP for South Kildare 1892 to 1903. He had been chairman of Kildare County Council, summed up the attitude of men like this towards the rest of the people on the estate, the lesser tenants. Of course, our meeting here today does not comprise all the Leinster tenants, inasmuch as the time was short and circulars were only sent out to those whose names we could secure at very short notice. And those would have included some of the people that we have listed here. I mean, you have the likes of Lawrence Brannigan, who held a block of 287 acres in Old Carton townland. John Sullivan, John Chandler, 270 acres between them in Rail Park. Matthew Fagan, 196 acres in Treadstown, and one of the largest of them all, Bartholomew Ellis, who held 242 acres in Dunnockstown, 119 acres at Larrabrine, the same in Maravilla, 189 acres in Maws, and 11 in Crickstown, or a total of 679 acres. These would be generally referred to as grazier farmers, right? And that's the way many of them will describe themselves later on then in the 1911 census. But these are the men who generally set it up for everybody else. If you want to find out who every single one of these, who purchased where, how much they paid, how much they were given, it's all available to us, because one thing about the British administrative system at the time, they kept great records, right? And they're all published in what's known as the Returns of Advances. A Google search will bring it up for you, and you can go through every single transaction under the Land Acts in that way. So, Morris is heir to the estate. As I said, he's a minor, but the trustees can act on his behalf. Under the final terms, 25 years purchase. So the trustees received a total of £754,265. In today's terms, about 60 million. Right? Now, because they had already paid off their debts, right, it meant that the vast majority, the bulk of this money, is available now for investment. And when you strip away all of the other commitments they would have had as landlords, right, and you invest that, then you realize that had not lots of other things come to bear, they would have done very, very well out of it. But what they do, and this is quite extraordinary, and nobody has ever been able to explain it to me, and I can't explain it to you. They invest nearly all of their money back into land through mortgages, right? Everybody else is creating these diversified share portfolios, but the Leinsters invested all, or the vast majority of it, back into land, right? And it's probably, well, it is on the advice of this gentleman, Baron Arthur Kinnard, a distant cousin. He was another trustee of the estate, and he was a director of Barclays, which was the 6th largest bank in Britain at the time. Some of you may know the name from a Netflix series called The English Game, because he's also the founding father of the English FA and holds the record for having played in more FA Cup finals than anybody else, right? And thus the other representation of him that you see here. But here are the main people that they invested the money with or to, right? So, just as I said, it just doesn't make a whole pile of economic sense for them to have done that. When Morris comes of age in 1908, he is committed to an asylum in Edinburgh in Scotland by Lord Frederick and under the instructions of doctors. And the reason for it is because Morris suffers from epilepsy. And at the time, unfortunately, because there's no understanding of what it is as a medical condition, it's associated, to use the terminology of the time, with lunacy, right? And I mean, I give you a sense of it. One of his contemporaries, one of Earl Fitzwilliam's sons, Catherine Bailey, in her book about him, Black Diamonds, writes, "The stigma of lunacy threatened the Fitzwilliams' fortune and position, their potential for alliances through marriage with other great noble houses. It also threatened their social omnipotence. Endemic to epilepsy was the risk of public humiliation, an eventuality of which members of the aristocracy were particularly fearful." So for that reason, Morris is institutionalized, right? Here you can see him, I mean, perfectly, otherwise healthy young man. And in his letters, again, full of poignancy. I mean, in one of them, as a young teenager, he writes to Evelyn de Vesey, who I said was his mother's best friend before she died, I intend to remain in Ireland and behave like my father, grandfather and ancestors towards the country. He has a sense of his own sense of Irish patriotism, if you like. And then when Lady Evelyn de Vesey gathers together a book of letters for him, to give him a sense of what his mother was like, he wrote back to her, I can assure you that they will always be in my company and close to me. I can assure you that nothing will receive more affection, love, respect than this lovely book of letters and my darling mother's books with her little markings and pencil in them. So you're getting a sense, if you like, of the family tragedy that begins to unfold here at exactly the same time that other things are happening. Meanwhile, his other two brothers, on your far right is Lord Desmond. And of course, Lord Desmond is a serving officer in the British Army when war breaks out in 1914. And at Calais in 1916, he's killed in a freak accident. He's teaching the regimental chaplain how to throw a newfangled hand grenade when the hand grenade explodes, right? And he dies as a result of the wounds that he suffers. Now, what's interesting from a Maynooth perspective on this is that, of course, his death is greatly mourned here, right? And he dies around the same time as the Easter Rebellion, right? And the county council meeting, the first county council meeting that's held after that, at which Lord Frederick is, of course, a member, the Nationalist County Council of Kildare passed a resolution of sympathy with Lord Frederick on the death of his nephew, serving his country, right, as they put it, right? The next motion passed at the same meeting condemns the leaders of the 1916 Rising. And that one will have been cut out of the council books, right? The other brother, Edward, right, who nobody would ever have thought might inherit the estate. Sorry? Oh, I didn't realise it. 1913, Edward married May Etheridge. She was known as the Pink Pajama Girl of Shaftesbury Theatre. It was a common enough trend at the time, right, for aristocrats marrying gaiety girls and causing great scandal. Lord Hertford, for example, down the road, married Rosie Booth. And of course, Rosie probably was the reason why the estate survived for as long as it did afterwards, right? But Edward married May, and in 1914, he was declared bankrupt. May was pregnant. The marriage didn't last very long. And I mean, Edward, a bit like his biological father, would be described as a rogue or a cad, right? But he joins the army as well as his brother, and he's retired out of it actually as a result of his wounds. But his debts accumulate to almost £70,000, which again, a massive sum of money at the time. And he meets this gentleman, Sir Henry Mallaby Deely. And Mallaby Deely is a speculator. He likes to buy property, he likes to flip it, make a great fortune from the same, and so on. And they enter into an agreement. And Mallaby Deely agrees to pay off his debts of £67,000 and pay him £1,000 a year for the rest of his life, tax-free. That's enough to live in very decent comfort in London and have yourself a butler and a maid and a nice apartment and so on. But the other side of it is, if Edward ever inherits, then Carton and everything else belonging to it will pass to Henry Mallaby Deely. In 1922, Maurice, the 6th Duke, dies prematurely in Craig House Asylum in Edinburgh. And, of course, the other brother has been killed now in the Great War. So Henry Mallaby Deely becomes the owner of Carton and essentially all that goes with it. This didn't stop Edward. So, starts all over again, and his rakish behaviour leads to a second bankruptcy by 1922, this time with debts estimated at about 56,000. Now, it becomes very complicated at this stage, right, as to who owns what and so on. But suffice to say, right, to simplify it, the trustees of the estate led by Lord Frederick and the now owner of the estate, Sir Henry Malaby Deely, come to an arrangement whereby they sell the contents in order to pay off this second bankruptcy. 1925, after a lawsuit brought by a moneylender by the name of Frederick Salomon, the first great auction is held in Carton. And one of the main purchasers is William Randolph Hearst, the great accumulator, right, who buys, they say, 25 Pantanaikons, which are articulated lorries, effectively, of contents from Carton, and he ships them off to America, some of which end up in his home in Santa Monica, and I would say quite a lot of them still in storage in warehouses, probably in New York, right? There are a series of auctions after that, right up to the 1940s, one that is still spoken about in Maynooth, indeed, to this day. Lord Frederick died in March 1924. Carton and Malaby Deely, Lord Frederick wrote to him at one stage and he said, I had been the fairy godfather as regards the estate. And to some extent he's probably right, because Malaby Deely kept the house and the domain and so on together. Chances are Edward wouldn't have been as successful in doing that. In 1937, Malaby Deely dies, and his family then eventually decide, or come to a decision with the trustees, to sell Carton and the remainder of its contents. It took probably so long because of the disruption with the Second World War. You can see here that the house itself was almost burned by the Irish Army when they used it as a billet during the period of the emergency itself. And just to wrap it up, right, what you're looking at now is a photograph of 4 generations. The elder gentleman in the middle is the 7th Duke, Morris. To your right is the 8th Duke, Gerald, and to your, am I right? The other way around, right? The other side is Morris, the 9th Duke, and the little lad on the knee is Thomas, Earl of Offaly, who unfortunately was killed in a car accident some years back. This is taken in the family home in Oxfordshire, where they moved to after the sale of Carton and so on. But you can see some of the paintings that came with them, including 2 Ashfords depicting the castle in the town itself. All of those paintings have subsequently came on the market and been sold. And finally, Edward, the 7th Duke. By 1943, in a life special, he contended that of the 26 dukes in Britain, he was too poor to be called a duke. In 1976, at the age of 84, he was found dead, having committed suicide in a bedsit in London, thereby, leading to the headlines of a bedsit duke and so on. And we're told that he was left with little more than the watch on his wrist and the clothes that flapped from his body. And this is the last slide, I promise you. This is, I don't know whether Arnold may have said this last week himself, right? But I think it's worth finishing off on something that Arnold wrote a number of years ago. The creation of the park at Carton is a spectacular achievement, the outcome of a series of interventions over a 150-year period between the 1680s and the 1830s. The size of the park is so great that it can really only be comprehended from the air. As a distinctive, superbly landscaped topographical unit, it is a remarkable physical and cultural resort, comparable to, although smaller, than the Great Phoenix Park. And as such, it deserves to be valued and jealously protected. And at that, I think I'll just leave it there. All right? Thank you.